It was that system which institutionalized the arrest of black men and women for reasons that had little or nothing to do with criminal behavior, but a great deal to do with intimidation and displays of racial power and incarceration for the purpose of producing profit. The radical reconstruction of the 19th century hardly lasted a decade. And it was completely dismantled in 1877 with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. What had begun as a promise of democracy, a radical promise of democracy, with former slaves at the forefront of the movements that were inspired by those promises. What began as a radical promise of democracy collapsed when troops were withdrawn, when anti-racist projects in state legislatures were dismantled, and when the South became subject to the rules of segregation and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Let us remember that during these few years of radical Reconstruction, it was not just black people who benefited. It was poor white people who also benefited from the new public schools, for example. Poor white children had never had the opportunity to get an education until former slaves demanded the right to public education. And white women benefited from new property laws. And everyone benefited from a process that was beginning to establish a non-racial democracy, something that had never been seen in the world since the era of the Haitian Revolution. And so when radical Reconstruction fell, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, democracy died, except in the hearts of black people. And so this promise of democracy, which was kept alive in the black freedom movements in the US throughout the 20th century, was an abolition democracy, a democracy that would be grounded in the abolition of slavery and which would entail the development of new institutions that would enable the incorporation of former slaves into a new, radically equal society. And of course, at many pivotal moments, this quest inside the United States was linked to African liberation struggles, as well as to struggles of people in Latin America and Asia. The abolition democracy never succeeded. Democracy never happened, contrary to what we are told all the time, including by our black president. The failure to produce the kind of social reconstruction that could have rescued the country and all of its inhabitants, black and native and Latino and Asian and white people, from the vortex of slavery and its consequences, was a monumental failure. In fact, the failure to complete the process of abolishing slavery has not only enabled many other forms of racism. For example, the violent anti-Muslim racism that has become especially repressive in the aftermath of 9/11. But also it has enabled heteropatriarchy and transphobia and so many other violations of human rights. We have no popular discourse that allows us to evoke the era of radical Reconstruction as one of the most pivotal moments in our history, the most radical era in the entire history of the United States of America. We have no popular discourse that allows us to talk about that era, but instead we have been left with the terrible racist ideas that were popularized at the turn of the century by D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which was the country's first feature film, a film about a Ku Klux Klan nation. Birth of a Nation. It was about the rise, the ascendancy of the Ku Klux Klan. And so that film foreshadows the prison nation that we are today. Lately, I have found myself emphasizing the importance of keeping our histories alive. And I don't know whether it's because I am accumulating more history myself as I get older. But these reverse trajectories, traveling back, remind me of how important it is to hold on to the unfulfilled promises. Not just the victories, but the failures. Because those unfulfilled promises help to create agendas for the present. And reverse trajectories also remind me how important it is for activists and academics not only to seriously examine the object of one's organizing or the object of one's research, but also to think about the conceptual and methodological approach one takes. In other words, we must try not to allow concepts to achieve the status of being taken for granted, even those concepts that appear to be the most obvious. And so we're talking about feminism this evening. So what do we think when we think about feminism? What is the first thing that comes into your mind? Women. Okay, women, yes, women. You may as well just say it. We immediately think about women, but when we use that category, do we really know what we're talking about? Well, if we don't know what we're talking about when we're talking about women, we may have a problem conceptualizing what women's rights are all about. And I just want to talk for a moment about the latter 20th century in the U.S., but also within international settings, policy settings, scholarly settings. There were many, many debates about how to define the categorical woman. And the struggles were over who gets included in the category woman and who gets excluded. So many of us viewed the struggle for women's rights at that time as ideologically saturated with unacknowledged race and class issues. In other words, as a struggle that purported to speak for all women while actually addressing issues of a relatively small group of women, white middle-class women. And that's a construction too, Walter. He just woke up. No, seriously, I totally appreciated what you were saying about the extent to which we often mistake the concept for the social realities that we're trying to understand. And white is, one of those concepts. And so we were concerned that working class women, poor women, black women, Latinas, Native women, other women of color, African women, Asian women, Latin American women had been kind of disappeared, from this category, this universal category, woman. And as a matter of fact, it was the many contestations over this category that helped produce radical women of color, feminist theories and practices. But at the same time, that questions about the universality of this category were being raised, similar concerns about the category human were being debated, especially in relation to what we saw as the underlying individualism of rights discourses, human rights. So how could that category be rethought not only to embrace Africans and indigenous people and other non-Europeans, but how might it apply to groups and communities and not primarily to individuals? And interestingly, it was at a conference in Africa, the International Conference on Women, the UN Conference on Women that took place in Nairobi in the summer of 1985. It was then that a feminism which contested the prioritization of gender at the expense of race, class, and nation began to take shape. The Nairobi conference took place in the midst of a period of a passionate contestation over the exclusivity of the women's movement. This was the first time that such a vast gathering had taken place in Africa. And it was the first time when there was a large U.S. women of color caucus at an international gathering of women. And so as I look back, I realize that the prevailing assumption at that time was that our work around the category woman was one of expansion, to make the category larger. We thought that it was our primary responsibility to expand the category, to make room for excluded women. So this was a project against racism, against nationalism, but we naively thought that we had effectively addressed the problem of the exclusivity of the category woman. Unfortunately, in the 21st century, there's still people who assume that it's just a question of making room to bring those in who get left out. Why don't you join us? So what we did not recognize at the time was that we had to rethink and refashion the whole category, rather than simply assimilate more women into an unchanged notion of what counts as woman. The importance of thoroughly rethinking this category gradually began to become clearer as we made deeper explorations into one of the early issues taken up by women's movements, and not only in the US and Europe, but also in Asia and Africa and Latin America. This was the issue of violence against women. Challenging the pandemic of violence against women emerged as one of the struggles that opened new organizing possibilities as well as new epistemological horizons. And in this context, let me refer to the work of scholar activist Beth Ritchie, whose most recent book is entitled Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and the Prison Nation. And so in her critique of the anti-violence movement, Ritchie refers to what she calls the every woman paradox, which in many respects recapitulates the earlier struggle over the category woman. and I'm quoting from her book, research began to assess the extent of violence toward every woman, as opposed to all women, as a way to convince people in power of the importance of the issue. The slogan was, it could happen to anyone. And then she goes on to say, in fact, the assumed race and class neutrality of gender violence, to some extent ignoring the issue of sexuality, led to the erasure from the dominant view of the victimization of lesbians, of women of color in low-income communities, and other marginalized groups. State violence and harmful public policies could not fit into the every woman analytical paradigm of the male violence that focused on individual men. The loss of focus on these groups seriously compromised, she says, the transgressive and transformative potential of the anti-violence movement's radical social critique of power, various patriarchies, economic exploitation, and heterosexism. And so she points out that it could happen to anyone. Anyone could be the target of male violence, of violence against women. And that anyone came to mean the women with the most visibility, the most power, the most public sympathy, the citizens, she says, whose experience of violence is taken most seriously. And so she argues that the image of every woman becomes a white, middle-class woman who can turn to a counselor, a doctor, a police officer, or a lawyer to protect her from abuse. Now, the overarching argument of her book, and it's really quite an amazing study, I urge you to read it. The overarching argument is that the reliance on criminalization led the feminist anti-violence movement to collaborate with law enforcement, therefore reproducing and advancing the already existing pattern of racialized criminalization.